All right, so welcome to the third panel of our migration webinar series. I am Cata Bailin, Faculty Director of LACIS, Latin American, Caribbean and Iberian Studies program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And this migration webinar series is prepared in collaboration with CLACS, Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the University of Wisconsin Milwaukee. So next panel is going to be prepared by them. Today's panel has been prepared and will be moderated by Sarah McKinnon. Sarah is Associate Professor of Rhetoric, Politics and Culture in the Department of Communication Arts at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research and teaching is in the areas of international rhetorics, globalization studies, and gender studies. And she authored a book titled Gendered Asylum, Race and Violence in US Law and Politics, which was published by University of Illinois Press in 2016. And this book charts the incorporation of gender provisions in US refugee and asylum law within the context of broader national and global politics. So the only thing I have to do right now is to say thank you to all our sponsors, which are LACIS, CLACS, and IRIS, Institute for Regional and International Studies at UW-Madison, and for everyone who has worked to make this migration series possible. And the LACIS team, a LACIS steering committee, as well as CLACS team and steering committee on their side. And special thanks to Sarah McKinnon, who has prepared today's panel, to our presenters and our public. And I'm passing the word to Sarah.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Kata, for that lovely introduction. And I'm here to do further introductions and then to moderate the panel. So what we've decided today is we'll have the speakers speak, and we'll take a little bit of time for question in the in-between for specific questions related to the panelists' presentations. And I'll make sure to save time at the end also for more broad questions, just to give you a sense of how this will be working. And I will keep an eye on the chat. So if there are questions for the panelists that you want to post there, I'm happy to field those questions. So let's begin this very exciting panel on Central America and migration. And let's do this alphabetically. So let's begin with Douglas Haynes. Douglas Haynes is a professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, where he writes and teaches courses at the intersections of ecology and social justice. He's the author of Every Day We Live is the Future, Surviving in a City of Disasters, which was published with the University of Texas Press. And Professor Haynes describes this book as a cautionary tale of urban inequality and the human suffering caused by climate change. The book recounts the true stories of two Nicaraguan migrant families and quest to survive in one of the world's most disaster-prone cities. That will be followed by Professor Wendy Voigt, who is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, with affiliate status in global and international studies, Latino studies, and women, gender, and sexuality studies. Professor Voigt teaches classes in global migration, race and ethnicity, and ethnography. Her publications appear in prestigious journals such as Geopolitics and Antipode, and her book, Lives in Transit, Violence and Intimacy in the Migrant Journey, published with the University of California Press, details the multiple forms of violence that migrants experience as their bodies, labor, and lives become implicated in global and local economies that profit from their mobility as racialized and gendered others. So I am very excited to hear from both our panelists, and I will turn it over now to Professor Haynes.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, Kata and LACIS and CLACS for organizing this and inviting me. I was really excited about the CLACS and the LACIS symposia last spring, and like everyone, of course, had to change plans. And so I was really excited to hear when everyone decided to reorganize in the virtual context for this fall. And I can't wait for our conversation together and hear what Wendy has to say. I'm gonna try to keep my remarks somewhat brief, but give you sort of an overview of major issues that have arisen out of my time in Central America, and my focus in particular on research for the book Every Day We Live as the Future. I am a narrative nonfiction writer. I do immersion journalism, which has a lot in common with ethnography, but I'm particularly interested in making big issues come alive through individual lives and individual communities. So a lot of what I'm going to try to do today is take us out of the realm of the abstract, or at least try to balance the abstract with some concrete images and short stories of people. I'm not actually going to read from the book, which I often do, but just introduce you to some people and the ways that their stories have intersected with larger forces, really at the nexus of urbanization, climate crisis, and inequality, and how those three forces are really intersecting in a big way in Central America, and have been for some time, to drive migration, both internally within countries within Central America, and of course, externally in the form of out-migration as well. I'm gonna start with a focus on in-migration, internal migration, rural to urban migration, and because that's really the focus of my work and the stories that I tried to tell and heard so much in my time throughout Central America. I lived in Guatemala for a while, about 15 years ago, but the bulk of my time in Central American work has been in Nicaragua. And I began research there and writing magazine pieces in 2008, and really focused on doing immersion research between 2010 and 2015. And I've been back several times since, but I'm going to really, like I said, build on that and focus on Nicaragua increasingly as I go through the presentation. I'm going to go ahead and share quick some slides, and throughout here I'll have both text and slides. And the slides, just to give credit, they're sort of a mixture of photos from a Nicaraguan photographer who's shot a lot for Reuters, who I worked with, named Osvaldo Rivas. There's some of my photos and some of a former student of mine, Elizabeth Kay, as well. So just the cover shot of my book. And this is actually the location here. This is a photo by Osvaldo Rivas. This is the La Chureca open air dump, which no longer looks exactly like this. That's a huge other story that was part of the story in this book, but it's to give you a sense of the lives, and one of the places where the lives in this book take place. And as I said, the lives in this book are centered on Managua, but they all started in places in rural Nicaragua in the 1970s and 80s. And I followed in this book really 3 generations of people, and to tell the stories of how families are transformed by migration to the city. And not just because that's important in Nicaragua or Central America, but because this is a global phenomenon of great importance. An estimated 3 million people a week migrate to cities around the world. And obviously, the speed and scale of this migration is something that's transforming not just people's lives, but the landscape around the world. And it is something that is really without precedent in terms of how we imagine and design and create cities, in terms of how we're going to try to confront it. To bring the focus closer to Central America is the second fastest urbanizing region in the world. We have a large percentage of Central Americans, almost 60% now, living in cities, and that is forecast to increase over the next generation or so, up to around 75%. And we're expecting 25 million new residents in cities in Central America by 2050. So this phenomenon is not going away, although it is changing to some extent, in the sense that previously it was really driven by people going to capital cities And the capital cities in Central America still have about a quarter of the population of the countries, but increasingly people in Central America are going to second cities or third tier cities as well from rural areas. But one thing that I really want to highlight here, and this will be a theme throughout my remarks, is that this urbanization, as I said, is transforming the landscape, that the total built up area in Central America has tripled over the past 40 years, and this has huge implications for how people live in the landscape and the kinds of ways that they are able to confront or the ways they become vulnerable to the increasing natural disasters that are part of Central American life. And we could have a conversation, of course, that those disasters aren't entirely natural, and that will become clear as I talk here. Forces driving migration. This is, for many of you, I'm sure, familiar territory, but so I'll just summarize it quickly. Lack of rural jobs in Central America, lack of rural healthcare, lack of educational opportunities, lack of infrastructure like roads, potable water, electricity, although Nicaragua in particular is making great strides on that front in the last decade or so. But these are all things that I heard over and over again from talking to people in asentamientos and in informal settlements in the city of Managua, in particular, over the time I have spent there. Increasingly, of course, violence and insecurity play a role, particularly in the Northern Triangle, which I'm sure Wendy will talk more about here in a little bit. Also, increasingly, the climate crisis and the instability of the climate, which is rapidly making agriculture less viable, particularly in the dry corridor of Central America and that mountainous kind of spine that stretches from Guatemala down into Nicaragua. People just not able to raise food in ways that they have relied on in the past. The climate crisis broadly, I think, is worth spending a little bit of time on because it is increasingly recognized as a driver of migration. It's not necessarily portrayed, I think, as often as it should, but Central America is really one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change in the world. Honduras and Nicaragua and Guatemala have consistently been on the major climate risk index that put out by this organization, German Watch, for years and years now, in the top 5 or the top 10. And you can see some figures there about some of the basic impacts of that. Of course, those impacts ripple out in all kinds of ways and are cumulative and accretional. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, just to give you a baseline prediction of what's going to happen, and everything that has been predicted so far has been happening in spades in Central America. In general, the region is facing rising temperatures, more severe droughts, increasing frequency when it does rain of increasingly heavy precipitation events, and of course rising sea levels as climate change accelerates, especially. Obviously, there are regional variations in these trends, in particular with precipitation. But one thing I really want to highlight is that the rising temperatures are going to be something I think that people are going to be hearing more and more about as outdoor labor becomes increasingly more difficult and more of a health risk in regions all around the world in the tropics, but particularly in Central America. Already, some of you might be familiar with the issues facing sugarcane workers in Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and that is definitely becoming to be known as associated with heat exposure, as well as pesticides and some other factors. But it's one example of the rising risks associated with heat. All of these climate trends, unfortunately, are being worsened by the already existing trends of deforestation, which is currently at a record clip in Nicaragua, and urbanization, as we talked about, which is also increasing in the region. I've got sort of a laundry list here of impacts of the climate crisis, some that are more well-known and some that are less well-known. Particularly in cities, the climate factor associated with illness is a huge issue. There's an increasing body of research about the association between vector-borne diseases like malaria, dengue, chikungunya, and heat and rising precipitation, increasingly severe precipitation events, which of course disproportionately affect people in low-income settlements. Outdoor labor, as I talked about, crop failures, as I talked about, coffee industry facing crisis, which is really destabilizing for rural areas. Damaged infrastructure, again, destabilizing for rural areas, farmers trying to get crops to market. Reduced water supply, both in rural and urban areas, another issue that I think you're going to be hearing more and more about. And there have been some interesting models coming out, especially in the last year. The New York Times and ProPublica just commissioned this huge study that was featured in the New York Times Magazine this summer about a huge model to sort of try to project how many climate migrants there will be coming out of Central America and Mexico in the next couple of decades. And the numbers get as high as 4 million. So that you can attribute very specifically to climate crisis, although of course that depends upon what the world decides to do to confront and mitigate climate change as well. Those models really are based on different projections about how we act in relation to climate change. In a more micro context, climate crisis is already affecting people and where they choose and can live, and sudden displacement is a reality. Obviously not just in Central America, but in Managua, I can tell you in the period that I spent there doing intensive research, 30,000 people were displaced just in those 5 years by flooding and landslides primarily from extreme rain events. And I'm going to introduce you to one of those people right now. This is Julio Baldelomar. And Julio was born in a small village on the slopes of the Masaya volcano in Nicaragua, migrated with his family to Managua when he was young, as did his sister, I'm going to tell you more about in a minute. He has worked most of his life as a street vendor. You can see him there with his platanitos. And Julio lived for a few years on the playa of Lake Managua, which you can see here at flood stage. This was at its height just after extreme floods in 2010, early 2011. And you can see here, the closest house to the water, you can see the power lines out in the water. But Julio's house, the playa, normally here you would see, well, there is no normal anymore, but often historically you would see a half mile to a mile of green open land stretching out before you from this spot here. Julio was living out there, was displaced by floods along with thousands of others in 2010, and wound up in this facility, the Padre Fabreto shelter on the west side of Managua, where many thousands of others of Managuans spent many people over a year in these shelters. Obviously, poorly lit, poorly ventilated, kind of incubators of disease. But for those people who stuck it out, almost every one of them received one of these government-built houses in Managua in a pretty aggressive resettlement campaign that the government sponsored. So it's an example of there are problems with moving communities and mixing people up from low-income communities all over the city and what that results in. But the government really did an impressive job of trying to imagine a safe way to do this with lots of community infrastructure and support, putting health clinics in these communities as well. And Julio and his partner, Jerry, wound up with a house like this where they still live today. So again, just wanted to put a face on that issue of sudden displacement and the fact that many people who are forced to squat because of lack of housing and because of little income find themselves quickly overnight, in Julio's case, having to flee their homes. As I said, I want to talk a little bit more about the convergence of urbanization and the climate crisis, because when we talk about climate, we often tend to talk about it sort of as separate from issues of migration and urbanization and housing in cities, but of course they are very intertwined. And what happens with urban sprawl, as cities grow, the watersheds around cities become deteriorated, they lose their forest cover, cities become even hotter, and they become even more prone to flooding. And that is exactly what has happened to Managua over the last generation or so, as both low-income settlements have spread along the fringes, but also, I should say, and this is true in many cities, the wealthy, seek in Managua the highest places to live, above the city where the air quality is best. And wealthy people are just as responsible for urban sprawl and spreading cities, and developers, as well as people, just trying to find a place to live wherever they can. Water scarcity is happening in Managua. Increasingly, that is a concern as urbanization draws down the water table. Drought happens. Again, this is a concern all over Central America. And then the combination here then makes the city even more vulnerable than it already was to climatic and geological disasters when they happen. And of course, the whole region is very vulnerable to those. 70 to 80% of infrastructure in Central America's cities is extremely vulnerable, at risk to disasters and extreme weather. So it's not just that disasters are more frequent and more likely to happen and more extreme, but when you have these rapidly growing cities, the infrastructure isn't able to keep pace, and governments, depending on where you are, aren't necessarily investing in infrastructure to bring people into the life of the city, and you have people, a large number of people living in extremely vulnerable circumstances. All of this, of course, exacerbates economic and social inequality and contributes to the reliance on the two phenomena that are really at the heart of this urbanization and rural to urban migration process: the growth of informal settlements and the explosion of the informal economy. I'll talk briefly about informal settlements. You see an image here of a little place called Las Viudas, the widows, in Managua, kind of stuck between a drainage ditch and Lake Managua. And this is the community where I spent a lot of time telling the story of Julio's family and his sister Diane, and another family who I'll introduce you to briefly. Just want to make sure I'm not taking up too much of my time here. And this community was founded, like many in Managua, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, as migrants poured in from the countryside into the city. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with these kinds of communities, so I'm not going to go into great detail. There are lots of different terms for them. But these are communities characterized by low quality shelters, crowding, often dangerous at-risk locations, and insecure land tenure. We have close to a third of Central America's urban population living in these communities. And again, that number is forecast to skyrocket over the next generation or so as well. Communities like this, not only in Central America, but around the world, are really recognized as one of the greatest human health risks that the world is facing over the next generation or two as migrants pour into cities around the world, particularly because of their association with high risk of vector-borne disease and illnesses caused by poor sanitation and poor air quality. And of course, you add things like a pandemic on top of that, and you've got a lot of health issues to be aware of. These are shots of the drainage ditch that goes through Las Viudas. This is very typical. That's why I wanted to show it. It's not extraordinary. This is actually just after a flood, when the water has receded. But what I wanted to highlight here was the vulnerability of people, of houses going right up to the edge of the ditch and often falling in the case of flooding events. And one thing I want to also highlight is that these don't have to be extreme, once in a lifetime flooding events. If you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, an hour of really intense rain can wipe out your house and your livelihood very, very quickly. Also, the infrastructure in these communities is very vulnerable to even, as I said, relatively minor precipitation or flooding events. If you have improvised infrastructure in terms of sanitation and electricity, that can go away very quickly, as you see here. These are also communities where people are very vulnerable to pollution. As you see here, Lake Managua is one of the most polluted bodies of water in the Americas. And so people living in close contact with environments like this are obviously disproportionately associated or impacted by disease. And this is an image of a home in a low-income settlement in Managua being fumigated. And this is a common sight around Managua, people going house to house, from the city workers going house to house, fumigating homes and patios for mosquitoes. I'm going to talk briefly about informal economy as well. Again, lots of terms for this. that have been debated in terms of their value, but I'll go with this relatively neutral one that's not without problems, but it's a catch-all term, right? For diverse economic activities not regulated, taxed, or protected by the state. What I want to highlight here is that this informal economy employs 60% of non-agricultural workers in Central America, including more than 70% in America. This is what people rely on when they move to the city from rural areas. And of course, that's not just true in Central America, in Latin America more broadly. It's true in the United States as well. It's important to recognize that people working in the informal economy are disproportionately exposed to often dangerous, toxic work environments. And I'm gonna show you a couple of examples of that here. This is the Mercado Oriental in Managua, where one of the families, Julio's extended family, who I introduced you to earlier, has spent most of their lives working. This market is about the size these days of roughly 55 super Walmarts and growing. It's massive, and a large proportion of it is staffed by workers in the informal economy. This is actually Julio's father. They run a business out of their home making platanitos. And I just want to show you another image of representation of the informal economy, of fishermen fishing using artisanal nets in Lake Managua, again, exposed to all kinds of risks of disease, heavy metals, toxins in this body of water. So I think it's important when we talk about migration and internal migration that we're talking about the ways people's livelihoods are changed and the kinds of risks that that exposes them to as well. Managua, again, of course, is not the only city that has been transformed in these ways, but I see it as very representative of the city of the future. Its population has skyrocketed over the past 50 years, mirroring Latin America's transformation from a largely rural region to the most urbanized region in the world. It was recently surpassed by North America as the most urbanized region in the world, but we're still talking about a huge proportion of the population living in urban areas. And in particularly in cities, there are less than 5 million people. So it's not necessarily mega cities we're talking about around the world that are absorbing these large numbers of rural to urban migrants. As I mentioned, you have about a quarter of the population in Managua living in informal settlements, disproportionately impacted by disasters and the impacts they bring. Going to introduce you to two more families to wrap up and bring us to out-migration, because these families are eventually going to find their way out of Nicaragua after moving from rural areas, which is not an uncommon phenomenon, that people hop from one place to another seeking further opportunities. This is Diane Balolomar and her family, her former partner Noel and Edwin and Gabriel, their children, who moved to, both of them, Managua, again, from the mountains outside of the city when they were young, and set up eventually a stand there in the Mercado Oriental. They worked here for over a decade selling sliced fruit and drinks by a bus stop, very busy bus stop, and I'm going to give you an image of that spot here in a minute, but I was always very impressed by the inventiveness, ingenuity, and of course, industriousness of people like Diane and Noel and their ability to really invent a living from nothing. And again, the downside of that, of course, is the incredible vulnerability that they face, not only to really difficult work environments, this is the setting around Diane and Noel's stand, but also increasingly natural disasters and the ways that not only climate-related disasters can affect them, but of course the pandemic has affected the business of people like this disproportionately in places like the Mercado Oriental and Managua. This is the other family I wanted to briefly introduce you to. This is Yadira Castellon, second to left, and her husband, Henry Munguia, in the center. Some of the children you see are their children. Two of the women here are Yadira's sisters, living in an extended family. They migrated to Managua in the 1990s from near the city of Jalapa, a tiny, tiny place called Yauli, up near the border of Honduras. And I just wanted to give you a couple of contrasting images here to think concretely about the change in livelihood and lifestyle and environment here. So this is where Yadira grew up, and this was their eventual first home in the city in Las Viudas, the community I was showing you images of earlier. It was, first of all, it was some cardboard and tar paper and plastic. It eventually became this. But Yadira and her husband, when they first got to the city, of course, had to also invent a way to make a living. And I wanted to share one other extremely hazardous and prone to climate disaster way of making a living, which is working as a waste picker. Again, a common way of making a living around the world. These are what are called in Managua chiriqueros, on top of La Chureca. And this is the image I started with, a very, I think, evocative image of the kinds of risks that people face in this kind of environment. In part because of the health risks you saw in the photo of this family. They have a son who has cerebral palsy, an extremely vulnerable respiratory system as well. In part because of the health risks that this family faced in the community they were living in. They were constantly seeking of ways to get out. Their first leap out was to a community on the fringe of Managua, still, but a little bit more of a formalized community. And then just in the past couple of years, Yadira's family decided they're going to make the leap, actually one by one, and then the last few of them just earlier this year to Costa Rica, where many Nicaraguans have been migrating for decades now. The migration pattern from Nicaragua is somewhat quite different from the migration pattern in the Northern Triangle. Certainly, the United States has absorbed a large number of Nicaraguans, particularly after Hurricane Mitch and after the Contra War in the 1980s, and a sort of slow trickle over the years. And there's been a slight uptick in migrants from Nicaragua recently to the US, but the vast majority over the years have gone to Costa Rica. And that is where both of the families that I just introduced you to here have wound up looking for opportunity. I have some basic stats there on the percentage of Nicaraguans in Costa Rica. About 1 million people abroad, so about 16% of the country living abroad, and a huge, obviously, economic impact coming from remittances from abroad, keeping the country afloat. As I mentioned, the estimates vary widely in terms of the numbers of Nicaraguans in Costa Rica, but we're talking anywhere between 250,000 and 500,000 people at any one time. It does change because some of that migration is seasonal for agricultural work and construction work. And more recently, there has been a large wave of socio-political migration. More than 100,000 Nicaraguans have left the country since 2018, when a wave of political violence gripped the country, and the vast majority of them are living in Costa Rica, although very few of them who sought asylum have received asylum so far. I'll close here just talking a little bit more about outmigration and some ways that outmigration from Nicaragua might intersect with outmigration from the rest of Central America. As I mentioned, a few 100,000 Nicaraguans, again, estimates vary a little bit in the US, but the numbers pale in comparison from the Northern Triangle. And there are complicated historical reasons for that I'm happy to go into maybe in Q&A if people have questions. But in particular, the security issue, or the lack of security, has not been the issue up until recently in Nicaragua that it has been in the Northern Triangle. I wanted to point out two very recent phenomena impacting outmigration from Nicaragua and Central America more broadly, though, of course. First of all, the decision just recently from the US Appeals Court that upheld the Trump administration's decision to rescind the temporary protected status for 5,000 Nicaraguans, 300,000 Salvadorans currently living in the US, many of them for a very long time, many of them who've had children. This makes them eligible for deportation next year. The Nicaraguans a little bit sooner than the Salvadorans, to my understanding. this may go through further litigation. It remains to be seen. But we have another way that the US is undermining efforts for people who have tried to make a new life for themselves in the United States here. I also wanted to mention migration during the COVID-19 pandemic, which has become a really kind of fluid situation that is a little bit hard to track. But in terms of Nicaragua in particular, and that back and forth movement with Costa Rica, it has really been very disruptive. Thousands of Nicaraguans have been turned away trying to enter Costa Rica since the pandemic began earlier this year. Hundreds have been unable to return to Nicaragua because the Nicaraguan government requires a negative COVID-19 test, and they've become trapped at the border, haven't been able to afford that test or haven't been able to get one. The border has opened and closed to commercial traffic at various times. There's been a resurgence of xenophobia in Costa Rica towards Nicaraguans who are viewed as bringing the pandemic to Costa Rica, particularly in the northern agricultural areas that rely very much on Nicaraguan agricultural workers. And I'd be curious to hear from other folks here today whether they've been tracking and what they've been hearing about the COVID pandemic's impacts on the region more broadly. I think I'm going to leave it there and make sure we have some time for conversation and make sure Wendy has lots of time to talk as well. I hope that has been helpful in both giving you kind of up close zoom in on specific issues and giving you some broader context as well. Thanks.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to change my mind and let's wait to do Q&A all at the end. I think that will make more sense. You make decisions in the middle of moderating. So I am going to turn it over to Professor Voigt to continue the discussion about Central American migration.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sarah, for the invitation. Again, I'm really sorry that we weren't able to all meet in person. And thank you, Doug. That was an excellent presentation. And I have lots of questions. And I'm also really glad that you're talking about the climate crisis and its effects on migration. I think you're right that most migration scholars are not talking about that. At least not yet. I think there's some newer research that people are starting to look into and graduate students who are looking into that. But it's really important and certainly something that I do not address in my work, but I think it's something that we're not going to be able to avoid from here on out. So I'm going to screen share my PowerPoint. I think I'm actually like in the midst of it. Let's see, is that on? Yep, for people? Okay, awesome. And I just want to apologize. I got the timing mixed up. And so I had orchestrated for there to be no children in my house during my talk. But now I think I just heard the voice of a child enter my home. So hope they know not to come into the room, but just beware in case you see a small person behind me. So today I'm going to be talking to you about my research that I've been working on since 2005 on Central American migration through Mexico, and primarily folks coming from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Also some people coming from Nicaragua, although not as many in the past 15 years. And the image that you have here is the front cover of my book. And yeah, it's actually just a smaller close-up of a mural that was taken at one of the migrant shelters where I worked in Oaxaca, Mexico. I worked as a volunteer in a humanitarian aid shelter and that serves migrants who are in transit through Mexico. And I have some more images of the shelter that I will share with you as we go through the presentation. So I just wanted to give you a quick overview of what I will be talking about today, a couple of the arguments that I will be making that's loosely based on the structure of my book, but I also wanted to kind of update my work because most of my fieldwork was conducted between 2008 and 2013. And a lot has changed since 2013. when it comes to Central Americans in the US, or coming to the US and through Mexico. So part of my goal as an anthropologist is to document people's stories, but to do so in a way that doesn't just leave us with stories. And part of what we do is to connect human experiences, people's lived experiences, to larger structures and processes. So the goal of my book and my research focus is on violence, but I look at violence right through lived experience and the types of violence people experience on the journey, whether it's physical assault, sexual assault, extortion, kidnapping, and death, but trying to understand, right, that violence, those very bodily lived experiences within larger structures of structural violence, okay, and to understand why this violence is occurring, okay, not just what's happening, but why. How can we understand the conditions that are shaping migrant journeys throughout Mexico and why they have become so violent for Central Americans who are traveling northward? So I develop an argument on various infrastructures, right? So looking at political and economic infrastructures at kind of the macro level, but also the infrastructures that are taking place in spaces along migrant journeys. So looking at kind of localized economies around violence, around kidnapping, around security, okay? And even kind of critically unpacking some of the processes around the shelters themselves. So I have a focus on violence, but then as an anthropologist, I want to know how people are responding, right? So how are individuals, the migrants, local residents, activists, right, responding to the violence? And we've seen some really kind of interesting and complex situations unfold throughout the journey in Mexico. And what I think that this work does is it complicates a lot of the ideas and stereotypes that we have about migrants, who are often either framed as criminals or victims. And we see a lot of gray area, as well as people like smugglers, who are kind of the boogeymen of the migration industry. And they're often blamed for exploiting people, and it's their fault that people are crossing the border or crossing Mexico. And in Mexico, where we have a really complex infrastructures of the drug war and immigration enforcement policies and Mexican policies towards Central Americans, smugglers are often needed in order to negotiate safety for people who are moving north. So again, thinking beyond kind of some of these traditional dichotomies. In 2010, some of you may remember the kind of situation for Central Americans entered the kind of the global, right, media stage after what is known as the Tamaulipas massacre, when 58 migrants were bound and executed on a ranch in the northern state of Tamaulipas in Mexico. And most of them were Central American. There were 14 women, one of whom was pregnant, and people started, and then after the massacre, mass graves were found in various states in northern Mexico, also of migrants. And so people started thinking, like, what's happening with Central Americans? Why are they here? Why are they being killed? Yeah, so that was kind of the first time that kind of we started thinking about Central Americans. In 2012, the US and US politicians started to think more about Central Americans during the so-called surge of Central American children and their arrival to the US southern border. Even though at the time, there were still more adults, right, arriving to the border, but the attention and the kind of humanitarian crisis and hysteria that was created around it really focused on the arrival of children. And it is true that around 2011, there was a shift, right? And we're seeing the increase in people coming from the Northern Triangle countries primarily. And we actually, in the United States, had a net decrease of people coming from Mexico. So that's a significant shift on the US-Mexico border about who's coming and why they're coming. And so a lot of the attention, media attention, started to say, like, who are these Central Americans? What's happening to them? And much of it was really focused just on the kind of awful violence that people experienced. But as an anthropologist, I'm trying to think about it with a little more nuance. Okay. And so one of the ideas that I put forth in my work is that we need to have an anthropology of transit and thinking about transit spaces. So in the migration literature, there's an emphasis on sending communities. So where are people coming from and why are they leaving? What are the so-called root causes of migration? What's propelling people to leave their homes? And then on destinations, right? How are immigrant communities faring with in terms of healthcare or education or mobility in North Carolina or Los Angeles or wherever people end up? But there's really a gap in the literature, or there was, I should say, when I started this research, because now this is kind of growing into its own literature of its own around transit and transit spaces worldwide, and thinking about the liminal spaces between home and destination and how these are really crucial social spaces, right? So people don't just jump on an airplane in their home community and then several hours later they're in their destination, right? People are all on their migrant journeys, right? For weeks, months, sometimes years, living in these really liminal spaces. And when I think about liminality, I'm talking about the physical liminality of not being either home or on your destination, but also kind of a social liminality that people experience. They're not connected to their networks. And the legal liminality. What do we do with these people who are in transit? And the laws are often very vague. In 2011, Mexico kind of updated its 1972 outdated migration laws or general law of the population to include new language around migrants. But up until that point, there had really been kind of this kind of ambiguity around their status, and there still is to a certain extent, and I can talk a little bit about why that is. And so I'm also interested in transit through a lens of enforcement and policing, and thinking about the regimes, so-called regimes of mobility that exist within these spaces. And when I was early on in my research, and I did my graduate studies at the University of Arizona and worked on the US-Mexico border in Nogales, and was very familiar with the border crossing and how deadly and dangerous it was. And when I first started this research, I was doing an interview with somebody, and he said, you know, the Mexicans have it easy. They only have to cross the border with the US. We have to cross Mexico. And in his eyes, Mexico was the barrier, was where there were more obstacles, and which was seen as more dangerous. And so we need to think about, why is Mexico so dangerous? One, it's dangerous because during that time, people were, as in this photo shows, riding on the tops of freight trains, okay? Not able to take traditional buses or cars because there's so many checkpoints. And so they were being funneled into these freight trains, which is free. But one, it's dangerous because people fall off, and many people have been dismembered from falling off the train, especially when moving at high speeds. They kind of get sucked underneath and often lose a limb. And there's actually a shelter that's primarily dedicated to people who have lost limbs along the journey. But it's during the years of my research, and kind of at the 2008, 2009, 2010, when we see the rise of the Zetas cartel and certain criminal organizations that started to see migration journeys as profitable to their organizations, right? We see them being taken, certain sections are taken under control of those criminal groups. And so the migrant journeys, and primarily through the train, are spaces of danger for people who are traveling. Trains are stopped, people are kidnapped and held for ransoms. In 2011, Mexico's Human Rights Commission did a study and documented, I believe, 11,000 cases of kidnapping of Central Americans in a period of 6 months. And so we were seeing kind of this massive disappearances and people being held for ransom, mothers and families throughout Central America who you know, what has happened to my children? Where did they go missing? Was it the US-Mexico border or was it in Mexico? And activists in Mexico estimate that over 70,000 migrants, Central American migrants, have gone missing in Mexico. So where do they go? There's lots of, you know, speculation that they're recruited to work for the cartels, that they're being sold into the sex industry, or like those in Tamaulipas, that they were killed and maybe ended up in mass graves. So a lot of unknowing around what happens to people. But I did actually interview a few people who had been kidnapped and escaped. Maybe a little later I can chat about that. So my focus, right, is on transit. And this is actually not a great photograph, but I think it gives you a sense of what my field work and field sites looked like. This is outside of a migrant shelter in Palenque. If any of you have been to the archaeological ruins in Palenque, it's a beautiful Mayan site. But these guys in the front are migrants who were staying at the shelter. And I had just interviewed them. And then we have local people in the middle who were probably going home for their afternoon comida. We have local residents who were selling food, elotes, to migrants at the shelter. And so we see how their daily lives are connected to the movement of people of these transit communities through their town. And we also have the presence of police, okay? And so the Mexican state, right, in all its forms, state police, municipal police, as well as federal agents, immigration agents, military, are often patrolling and nearby migrant shelters or the routes where they're moving, okay? And it's sometimes because they're, you know, detaining people and deporting them, and we have seen an increase in this over the past decades, but it's oftentimes simply to extort people. And the more than half of the people that I interviewed, and I interviewed hundreds of people, were extorted by Mexican state officials during their journeys, in addition to other people. So my focus on transit, right, is not unique, right? The movement from Central America to the US is not the only transit zone. We have transit spaces throughout the world, and there's, as I mentioned, a growing body of scholarship on transit. A lot of it is coming out of Europe and looking at movements from countries in Africa to the Mediterranean, right? And the Mediterranean is actually the epicenter of migrant death. The IOM, the International Organization of Migration, right, has a project documenting migrant deaths around the world. The Mediterranean is the epicenter, but we also see very dangerous journeys to Christmas Island, for example, in Australia, and other locales around the world. So I think it's important kind of theoretically to think about movements and this kind of increase in movements and state enforcement policies and the production of violence and of death on that kind of global level. So my research, as I mentioned, takes place in migrant shelters, about a dozen migrant shelters throughout the southern Mexican states of Oaxaca, Chiapas, Veracruz. I primarily worked as a volunteer in one shelter in Oaxaca, and basically just did daily tasks. You know, I would accompany migrants who needed medical attention to a local clinic that was willing to help people despite their status, doing intake interviews, helping people make phone calls to their families back home. That was one of the most important things that we did, was to make sure that people's family members back home knew where they were and how far they had gotten on the journey. Because if they do go missing, there's a record of them and we can kind of start putting the pieces together. That was another part of my work, was working with families of missing migrants and trying to locate them in the US, either right through the medical examiner's office or other organizations, if we had any details of where they had crossed the border. This is just a map taken inside of a shelter to give you a sense of where migrant shelters are located. So they're not just along Mexico's southern border with Guatemala or the northern border, but they're actually throughout Mexico. And this is significant because it shows you where people are in need and where they need attention. And this corresponds to an argument that I developed, and I'll mention in a minute, about Mexico's arterial border and the border making practices that we see in Mexico's interior. So just a couple of snapshots of inside migrant shelters. A lot of my time was spent, just hanging out and chatting with people, right? There's a lot of waiting. People are bored. Especially kids, there's nothing to do. They're stuck in the shelter. So, time doing food preparation, playing games, looking at maps, a lot of time thinking about where people are going, where they've been, the stories that have happened to them at different points along the journey. So working at shelters was strategic, right? For me in terms of my personal safety. And I was kind of able to work within those organizations, but also those are spaces where I was able to build rapport with people. And, sometimes folks would arrive in the morning and leave that afternoon. I wasn't able to do, in-depth ethnographic interviews with them, but many times people, and especially more vulnerable migrants or people who had recently been robbed, would be at the shelters for weeks at a time. And with those people are the ones who I was really able to build relationships with and do more in-depth interviews about their lives and their plans. So I'm not going to really have time to go into all of these larger structural conditions, but I just want to mention, right, again, that we can't understand these movements, as Douglas mentioned, right, in a vacuum, as just, this household is deciding, or this person is deciding to move, that there are larger forces that are propelling that, whether it's the climate crisis, okay, or movement to urban areas, or as I develop in my book, I'm looking at other issues, particularly in the Northern Triangle, issues of violence and insecurity. And so post-war violence, right, after the civil wars in El Salvador and Guatemala, combined with neoliberal economic policies that kind of came into those countries in after the wars in the 90s, right, created this, what scholars call post-war violence, that some people describe as even more violent than during the wars. And massive kind of insecurity, control of local neighborhoods by gangs, extortion, at all levels. So I just documented so many stories of people who just simply weren't able to make a life for themselves or provide for their children. And, the whole gamut of horror stories of violence in the neighborhoods, the recruitment of younger people, particularly young men, but also young women to work for different gangs that controlled their neighborhoods, and many people feeling like migration was the only way out, that their only chance of survival was to leave. So we need to think about it within those contexts, this kind of larger political economic, the war on drugs, and thinking about how since the 1990s, drug flows from South America have, instead of moving through the Caribbean, are now moving through Central America and Mexico to get to the US, right? Our consumption hasn't changed, but the routes have changed. And the movement of drugs through land routes, because we've closed off and cracked down on the Caribbean, has really reshaped the region and really kind of been the fuel for the this kind of new iteration of the war on drugs in Mexico. We also can think about these movements in relationship to larger transnational security initiatives, the Merida Initiative, the Central American Regional Security Initiative, NAFTA, CAFTA, the economic policies as well, and think about the role of the United States historically during interventions during the civil wars, but also through security initiatives, and how much money we're funneling to security operations and militarization in Mexico for their border and immigration enforcement. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. This is the physical border between Mexico and Guatemala near Tapachula in the state of Chiapas. And as you can see, it's a porous border. I was actually standing on the official checkpoint, right? I had kind of just passed through the bridge and was taking a photo of the river, and people are crossing all day long and all night long, just with their families, carrying goods over to sell, carrying things back that they had bought in Mexico. And, you know, the Mexican state officials are just watching it, and that's that's what they see on a daily basis. It's not until you get into Mexico's interior that we really see the rise of Mexico's border enforcement strategy, right, and mechanisms. So it's not actually the national borders, right? So it's forcing us to think, kind of expand our understandings of what is a border, and how do we make borders, and what are these kind of border making strategies? What do they entail? So we have seen since the late 80s and during the Central Wars, and then in the early 2000s under President Vicente Fox, and then after the surge, right, so-called surge, the humanitarian crisis in 2012, the implementation of different Mexican security operations, right, that are meant to curb movements from Central America, right, through checkpoints, through, you know, patrols, through detention, containment, right, the whole infrastructure around border security, and how that has kind of where those spaces are and how they where they take place. And as I argue, we need to reconceptualize the border as arterial, right? People have talked about the vertical border in Mexico and trying to make the argument that the border is not horizontal, like we often think of the US-Mexico border, but that it's vertical because we have all these militarization throughout Mexico going northward, but it's actually arterial, and it follows the central highways and train routes where people are moving, and that will give us a better sense of these border making practices, and as well as how they're connected to more recent immigration policies under the Trump administration, which I'll end on in a few minutes. So I'm not going to really, I realize, have time to go into depth into my arguments that I make in my work, but I just want to quickly go through them. Much of my work is looking at the industries, as I mentioned, the local industries, right, that have arisen in transit spaces in local communities, and the ways that Central Americans have been racialized and constructed as others, and often dangerous others, and how that's reshaping, right, local communities and who's making money off of them. So we can think of, you know, the local vendors who sell bread or popsicles to migrants at the shelter, to the money order, you know, Western Union companies that are there, and they are central to the kidnapping and ransom industry that has arisen along the migrant journey, right? So, you know, people would often say, well, why are they kidnapping these, you know, people who are so poor? Because most migrants who are able to migrate have family members in the US. And so the criminal organizations know that if you have a family member, you might be able to raise $1,000 or $5,000, right, to send to them. And they're sending that money through Western Union, right? And so thinking about how those companies are profiting off of some of these economies of violence. So really thinking about the kind of local economies throughout within these transit spaces, thinking about the impacts on people's bodies and how violence, right, marks people, right? It marks people through injuries, through scars, through dismemberment, through trauma, reproductive health, right? People, you know, are traveling and they get their period, they're having a miscarriage, they're pregnant, right? And they need health care, during their journeys, right? Maybe they're there for a few months. Two of my closest interlocutors were fleeing violence in El Salvador, and they ended up just settling in Mexico and working, and because she was pregnant, and they said, we don't even want to get to the US, we just needed to get out of El Salvador. And so thinking about all those issues, those kind of embodied issues that we don't always associate with migration, it's often treated as very abstract, right? And thinking about how people's bodies are marked and changed throughout their journeys. And I'm also interested in the intimate relations and kind of intimate economies that emerge in transit spaces between people, between migrants and smugglers, between migrants and residents, okay? How these transit spaces create the conditions for these new types of social relations and really intimate relations to emerge. And when I say intimate, I don't just mean sex, but any type of personal closeness. When I was doing this research, I often met people who were, they would say they were husband and wife, and then later they would say, well, she's not really my wife, or he's not really my husband. We just met at the other shelter. We've only met 3 weeks ago, but we pretend to be. We're now traveling as husband and wife, legitimate. Like, Central American man seems more trustworthy if he's traveling with a woman, and a woman feels like she has protection if she's traveling with a man. Thinking about like how people are reimagining even kinship relations is. Along with this, right, builders and in the communities, and as you can imagine, right, there's quite a significant amount of discrimination and prejudice around Central Americans coming through, and so and when there is also violence, and so I've documented a number of cases where shelters have actually had to close after community neighborhoods demanded their closure, and some of the kind of community tensions that arise around shelters, right? Think about your neighborhood, and if there was a migrant shelter here and now you have all these outsiders, as well as the security within shelters themselves. So these two pictures are actually taken of the same shelter, one of the shelters where I worked in Oaxaca. On the left, I think that was like 2007. It was basically like a dirt lot with some folding chairs and tables and an outdoor kitchen. That was the shelter. When I first arrived, the taxi driver was like, I don't know what this shelter is you're talking about. And then on the right is the same shelter in, I think, 2013. And you can see it has concrete, bricks and barbed wire. And there was actually video camera surveillance, and Doctors Without Borders had put a clinic there to serve migrants. So it's this kind of whole infrastructure and security of the shelters themselves that I think are really interesting to unpack. And another part of this research is looking at the work of local people and the ways that we have to look not just at violence, but also at hope and of solidarity of local people who are working day after day to serve people in transit. And I realize my time is going, so I'm going to go really quickly. A lot of this work is done by women, and so I have kind of a gendered analysis of why this is. This is picture is the inauguration of a new shelter that was opened in a city called Matias Romero in the state of Oaxaca. And you can see the women wearing their traditional Zapotec traje coming and kind of celebrating the opening of the shelter and welcoming of people into their towns. And also thinking about the gendered work of the mothers primarily, but families of missing migrants throughout Central America, and how they have kind of connected and created solidarities with some local organizations in Mexico. So I think we should move to questions. So I think Doug mentioned some of the more recent policies under the Trump administration that have really reshaped what's happening. And so maybe we'll wait for questions, or I'd be happy to chat with people later about under the Trump administration, this kind of the Remain in Mexico program, what's also called officially the Migrant Protection Protocols, and not allowing people the right to seek asylum in the US, but having to stay in Mexico, which is considered a safe third country, which, as my research and the research of many other people have documented, is certainly not safe for Central Americans passing through. So I think I will just end there, and maybe it's time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy. This was fantastic. Both presentations got so much, and I have lots of questions, and I'm sure many of our attendees also have lots of questions. So I am happy to field questions that come in at the chat, and I don't know if attendees have the ability to ask questions verbally. Kata, do you know? Or M? Well, let's just start with the chat and then we can go from there. But if you have the capacity, feel free to also ask a question out loud. That works for me too. So we have one question to start with, and then we'll go from there. So Kata in the chat asks a question for Douglas. Kata asks, could you talk about the meaning of the title of your book, about the idea of living in future?
Sure. The title is meant to function on a couple of levels, but it's one of those gifts you're given as a researcher or a writer. Sometimes a good friend of mine was just informally, we were chatting one day and she said, you know, every day we live in the future. And what she meant by that was every day for us is the future, as in we can't think about tomorrow. We just have to focus on our needs right now, right? The future is not meaningful for us. So there's that sense of it. But of course, in the broader sense, I was also becoming more and more aware of how the people I was talking to in my work were enmeshed in these global forces that are defining the future for us. And of course, that's not, you know, written in stone kind of future. Nobody can say what the future is, but the kind of picture I tried to paint with these stories was a larger global picture of the choices we have to make about what kind of future we want to construct, given the forces at play in terms of urbanization, climate, and migration.
That's great. Thank you. We have another from Alan Schultz who asks, what are the best ways to support migrants as they journey? And I bet this is probably a question that both of you might have some thoughts to. Let's maybe start with Wendy.
Sure. Vote. Vote in your elections. Vote for policymakers who are looking at migration. One thing that I've really learned is that, you know, the issues facing migrants in Mexico and the policies targeting Central Americans has everything to do with US politics and pressure from the US government onto Mexico to curb those movements. And so, you know, the money that they're getting, the funding, the training, and as well as the political pressure and the kind of, you know, all the discourse and rhetoric that we're hearing about the caravans and that whole hysteria about people coming from Central America is about US politics. And so I think, you know, one kind of easy thing, if you will, that we can do here is to be active in politics and think about the policies of our, the people that we're voting for and able to vote for at all levels in Congress, not just the president. And putting pressure on those folks. So I think that's important, but there's also, you know, we can donate money. And that's something we can do during the pandemic to organizations that are serving migrants, and to shelters and to, you know, lawyers and people who are working with people in the detention centers at the border, working with people who have been sent to Mexico to wait for their hearings. So there's lots of places where I think that we can intervene, as well as just talking about this and seeing migrants as human beings, which I really appreciate, you know, Doug's emphasis on kind of the human stories. And so much in our discourse, we don't think about migrants as human beings. And I think that's like a really simple thing that we can do just in our everyday conversations.
Thank you. Doug, did you have something to add to that? Yeah, okay, I just wanted to make sure.
That was really lovely what you just said, Wendy, there at the end about emphasizing people's humanity, because I think that influences politics and political choices as well. The more people understand and communicate about migrants as people responding to big forces in their lives, just like everybody else does, right? I guess I would just add to that, find ways to support or get involved personally with migrants in your community. There are lots of great organizations working with both migrants and refugees, like Lutheran Social Services, Jewish Social Services, and organizations like here in Wisconsin really doing great work advocating for migrants and supporting migrants, like Voces de la Frontera. So there are ways to get involved on this end as well. I also, I guess, in my ongoing communications with people in Central America, feel like an obligation to be really honest about what we know about the picture here that they may or may not know. Of course, they know things about the picture there that we don't know here, but to share those things and share the dangers and the realities of migrant life here. Of course, now with everybody so connected, so many migrants before they leave, or potential migrants, know people already here and so can learn about those realities. But there's often misconceptions as well. So I guess I just feel, as a person connected with people in Central America who talk about migrating a lot to the US, keeping that two-way communication really open and honest about the realities and dangers of it.
Great. So we have a few more questions in the chat right now. So there is a question about the connection between Central America and the dairy industry in both Mexico and the United States. So, you know, as folks that are from Wisconsin, some of us, so that's an interesting question. And then another question about the intimacies that, Wendy, you talked about, specifically in relation to children. So did you see any intimacy formation with children, like people taking kids under their wings, like that sort of stuff? So I'm excited to hear thoughts on both of these questions.
I know nothing about the dairy industry, so I'm gonna leave that question. Maybe Douglas, you know more about that. I'll just quickly say, children. You know, I interviewed kids who were, or spoke with. I wasn't allowed to officially interview them for my IRB, but met children who were migrating by themselves. And sometimes these are often like young teenagers, you know, like 13, 14-year-olds who had parents or moms who left when they were young, and they decided that they were of age and they were going to make their way to find mom. And yeah, absolutely. There's, you know, older migrants would kind of take them under their wing and travel together, typically in shelters. Like very rarely would you see people that were migrating by themselves. People were often moving in groups and with people that they had met throughout the shelters and journeys. And these groups would fracture, and then they would meet new people, and they were ready because they had enough money, but the other folks don't. So they're going to wait a few more days and they're going to go on. So people were constantly creating these relationships. One of the most heartbreaking things, though, when it comes to kids, was meeting a family, and they had a very young, a baby. I guess it wasn't an infant, but it was a young baby, as well as some older kind of toddler age kids. And they were migrating with their cousins. And after a few days at the shelter, it came out from the cousins. They said, you know, they're not actually, just our cousins. They're actually our smugglers. And they use their children to get handouts along the journey. And that's part of their strategy. And so it's this very complicated kind of family dynamic happening, but the kids were also kind of being exploited in a way in those kind of desperate situations. But for the most part, absolutely, you know, people were, when there was a kid who would come, you know, arrive to the shelters, you know, it was kind of all hands on deck, and what can we do to help them? But you know, in recent years, it's a lot more children that are moving through than in like the early 2000s. So a lot more work to be done on those movements, and obviously what's happening in the detention centers.
Douglas, do you have thoughts for the dairy industry?
Speak briefly to that. It's actually a project that I started kind of on the tail end of this book project, interviewing dairy workers here in Wisconsin. And it's another kind of underreported story. The Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism does have some really great pieces on it. But the dairy industry in Wisconsin, and this is true in all big dairy states, New York and Vermont as well, is increasingly reliant on migrant labor because of the nature of the industry and the consolidation of the industry. The dairy industry has been kind of late in industrializing or adopting this big farm model, but it's finally happened in Wisconsin in the last decade or so. And the labor pool is drying up because migrants aren't coming. But of course, you also have these people supporting this industry who are largely unseen in the communities where they work. And politically speaking, many, though not all, of course, farmers and rural areas in the places where these workers are quite caught up in anti-immigrant rhetoric. So there's some really interesting tensions there. Another really interesting thing about it is you have all kinds of fascinating little cross-cultural intersections happening around the state of Wisconsin. There's a huge community of Nahuatl speakers up in really rural areas in Trempealeau and Buffalo County, living in trailers on farms from Veracruz. And then there's all kinds of Central Americans as well. In Richland Center, there's a cheese factory full of Nicaraguans. So not only the farms themselves, people doing the milking are full of migrants, or people who are choosing to stay if they can. But the whole industry itself is becoming supported by migrant work from Latin America, or workers.
I see we have some more questions both in the chat and the Q&A. That was new to me. We have two venues here. So I'm going to try to summarize some of these and throw them back out to you. So Wendy, there's a question about someone heard that recently the Mexican government had taken measures to reduce migrant travel by freight train. So thoughts about that? Is that actually the case? In the Q&A, a question that's related is your assessment of AMLO's, so López Obrador's policies compared to previous administrations with Central American migrants. So what's happening with the Mexican presidency and administration in the current moment. And then the last question, throwing a lot at you right now, is whether the changing patterns, what you were describing as arterial migration, have anything to do with the fact that families are moving together. So is there a relationship there between what you're theorizing and the patterns on the ground?
Okay.
Oh, I know. Take one. Go where you want.
My brain. Okay, so I'll try to answer these quickly. So after the Programa Frontera Sur, the Southern Border Strategy was implemented in 2014. Part of that strategy was to make traveling by trains more difficult. And so the Mexican government actually worked with the train companies to speed up the trains, which traditionally would be very slow and stop for a long time. And people were able to kind of get on and off within these kind of transit communities. And so it was actually their policy to speed them up and then strategically raid those places where people were getting on and off the trains and hotels in the transit communities. And so what that did was force people to find more clandestine measures, right? To force them to work even more with smugglers who were able to have private transportation and safe houses and all of that kind of stuff away from the shelters. And so some of the shelters where I worked, I talked to my colleagues who work there and they said, it's a ghost town. There's nobody here anymore. We used to have 300 people a night and now nobody's passing through because of those policies. And so they actually worked and people were not riding the freight trains. It doesn't mean they weren't coming. We know because of the numbers of the US-Mexico border, they are still coming, but they're having to come in more dangerous clandestine routes. So that's the freight train. the other questions were about AMLO, and oh dear, there was a lot of hope, including by activists in kind of that world, and migrant rights activists, and still a lot of support that AMLO was going to kind of change things. And there was a lot of talk about human rights of migrants and changing this. But as we have seen in the past few years, that AMLO has continued the same strategy of his predecessors. And, you know, Trump has really held that out. We're not going to renegotiate NAFTA or, you know, tariffs or DACA. I mean, he tweets like, those kids aren't going to get DACA, you know, unless you stop the caravans, right? Like these kinds of remarks. But for the most part, AMLO has continued those strategies and is working closely with the US government in stopping people and increasing enforcement in Mexico's southern border region, but also for those people who are denied asylum and are being forced to wait it out in Mexico. And Human Rights Watch actually has compiled a database of all the examples. Like there's over 1,000 examples that they've collected of violence for people who had been returned, who were seeking asylum, who are in Mexico waiting. And so that's how it's going under AMLO. And then the third question was about the caravans. Okay, arterial migration.
Yeah, and whether like the fact that people are moving as families, whether there's a relationship between those two things together.
Migration, families moving to I mean, the caravans are, in my eyes, one, the caravans were not necessarily new. They were new to kind of the American public, but people had been traveled in caravans before, and have used caravans as kind of like a political strategy to raise awareness, but they're also for safety. And especially as the Mexican government has cracked down on those transit routes, that people felt like they couldn't, right, travel alone, but that they would travel in large groups for safety reasons. And so I think that's where we see the emergence of those caravans for people who were just, you know, desperate to get out of their home situations. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. The last question is a question for both of you, and it's a question that's a methodological question. So what is something you could do or you would do different in your field work? So what is something you wish you would have known before? Or if you want to take it in another spin, do you have recommendations for other generations of researchers? It's a big one, I know. Thoughts? Thoughts about field work?
Do you want to start, Wendy, or do you
Sure. Well, I mean, for my specific research, I think when I started, I was so excited and like eager that I was a bit naive. And I often think like the things that I did then, just like walking up and down the railroad tracks, finding people to interview, I probably wouldn't do that now, knowing what I know. And also the context has changed and it's become much more dangerous. So I think being really smart about your research and making sure you're safe, but also really taking the time to connect with local people on the ground and include them, you know, for graduate students into your research questions. I mean, that's going to make your proposal stronger, your research stronger, to answer the questions that local communities want to know about what's going on. And I think doing that from the very beginning, instead of, you know, a question that's tagged off at the end of your questionnaire or whatever, will transform your research and make more of an impact in concrete ways in people's lives. And so doing that from, you know, your very first exploratory research trip, you just got a Tinker grant and you're going down there. Talk to people about what they want to see research and how you might be able to use your resources to help in local communities.
I think I would really just echo that. The first two things that came to my mind were one about relationships and one about ethics. The relationships are everything, and I was very fortunate with this book project that I had the relationships first, and the book evolved later. And that meant everything, especially not just with the individuals I ended up writing about, but the community as a whole, because feeling welcome in the community where you're working and that people understand why you're there makes so much difference in not only the work itself, but just as a human being, your interactions with people. And I think I had an intuitive sense of that when I started, but now as I've tried to start other projects, I've realized, wow, that made all the difference that I had those relationships first. In terms of ethics, I feel like it's just an ongoing learning process. You have to negotiate every new situation when you're doing immersion work with other people, particularly when you're crossing cultural and economic boundaries, or gender boundaries as well. That you're very clear with yourself, and you're very clear with the people you're working with about where your lines are in terms of what you share with them, how you're going to involve them, you know, how you communicate with them about being collaborators and what that means for them, what the consequences of research are. And then if you're working with low-income people or migrants, economics are always going to play a role in how you are able to contribute economically or not, depending on your professional position, on your particular discipline's negotiation with that question. You need to be really clear with yourself about all the different kinds of situations you're going to find yourself in around money and giving money, or food and giving food, and you know and communicate with people honestly.
Thank you so much to both Professor Voigt and Professor Haynes for this wonderful presentation. I certainly know that I learned a lot and have lots of questions and thoughts to continue forward in my own work and my own teaching, but also as we continue to think about migration over this symposium. And thank you to Kata and Em for the organizational work that you've done, and to all of the attendees who participated with us today. I hope that everyone has a lovely, lovely rest of your afternoon. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
It was great meeting you, Sarah.
It's great to meet you too.
Take care.
Your work sounds great. I'm gonna go look it up. Great, I can't wait.
I was teaching an interdepartmental seminar, and I was thinking about using the recording of today's panel for that seminar, and I was just wondering if both of you can think of a piece of your work, a chapter or an article that you would like to send along with this recording for grad students to read.
Yeah, sure.
I would really appreciate it.
Can you just
forward you?
To remind me, and yeah, that'd be great.
And Kata, this recording is available for others. Is that correct?
That's
great.
right.
Yeah.
And I think
I was actually just talking to a student today in one of my communication arts classes, and she said, "I'm listening to this great migration seminar from the, and I was like, wait a second, I'm, the moderator." It was so great. I loved it. So yeah, she was like, "This is amazing." So I think, yeah, it was really great.
Yeah, I'm gonna go order your book now, Doug. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Likewise.
I already did with your, it was done. I was like ordering them as
it's on the way.
It was really great the ways that our different emphasis really complemented in
Absolutely.
The big picture.
Yeah, definitely.
But it sounds like we've also had a lot of similar experiences on the ground.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure you're actually an anthropologist, so.
Where I fall short is theory, I'm afraid.
Yeah, who needs theory? You're an applied anthropologist.
Okay, I'll take that.
All right, well, I hear my people it's outside shouting, so I'm gonna log off, but great to meet you all. Thank you so much.
Great to meet you as well.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, be well.
Bye-bye.